Thank you, Sophie. Virginia, would you like to go next?
Thank you. And I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm dialing in from the unceded lands of the Wallumattagal clan of the Darug Nation here in Sydney. And I'd like to acknowledge any elders past and elders past and present, and also acknowledge any First Nations people joining us on this call, on this webinar today. And thank you for the enormous contributions that you make to this nation, to this landscape, and for sharing so generously of your culture and knowledge and wisdom, and while at the same time not really asking for anything in return except our solidarity. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. My name is Virginia Mapedzama. I am the scholar in residence at Diversity Council Australia. I'm also the director of special projects, which is just a way of saying I specialize in anything to do with racial equity. Sorry, I lead anything to do with racial equity, anti-racism, intersectionality, xenophobia, all of those related concepts at Diversity Council Australia. Diversity Council Australia is a not-for-profit peak body that focuses on all things diversity and inclusion in Australian workplaces. So we're not just limited to racial equity. It's everything: gender equality, based on gender, age, sexuality, etc. I'm just here because my work sort of cuts across through that intersectionality lens that we give at DCA. What we call ourselves DCA, short for Diversity Council Australia. And prior to working at Diversity Council Australia, I worked in a couple of not-for-profit organizations as well, and government departments, but the majority of my career, I've worked as an academic, pretty much in the area of sociology of difference, but focusing on critical race theory and migration studies.
Thank you, Virginia. And last up, Jack.
Jacko. Always love to do an acknowledgement of country because it's this opportunity, particularly with recent events in the last week or so. It's a reminder that it's a privilege to be able to acknowledge the country that we're meeting on. It's a diplomatic practice that goes back, thousands of years. It's a fantastic opportunity for us to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on today. I'm on Nunnamal and Ngambri land, and I grew up on objectively gorgeous Kabi land in Queensland. And I want to pay my respects to First Nations people who are on the call today. My name is Jack Hayes. I am a researcher at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, sitting in my office maybe 300 meters from Jacko at the moment. I'm also a PhD candidate. I have a focus on LGBTIQ+ and queer experience. So I'm in the third year of my PhD looking at the experiences of queer diplomats. So a kind of pertinent topic of research for discussion today. Speaking of, excited to get into it.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. And I'll just briefly give some context for me as well. I'm also a researcher here at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. My name is Jacko Jackson, but you can also find me by Googling Emma F. Jackson. I use they and she as my pronouns, and my research is broadly around trans inclusion in the workplace. So I feel like I also might chime in at a couple of points to contribute to the conversation. But yes, we'll get stuck into the conversation, and just a reminder to our participants that we do have an open Q&A session following some of our kind of organized discussion. So as we go through, feel free to put some questions in the chat. And yeah, we'll hopefully get to them at the end of our time. So we have a nice opening question. When we talk about backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, what exactly are we seeing in Australia today? And how does it show up differently for different communities? Maybe I'll chuck to Virginia first.
Thank you. I want to start by clarifying, because at DCA, or Diversity Council Australia, we are making a real big clarification on whether it is like trying to really, have that conceptual clarity around what is it that we're actually talking about, and what is backlash versus what is resistance or pushback, or some of those terms. We tend to want to use more words like resistance as opposed to backlash. Because for us, the notion of backlash is really quite, we feel with the work that we've, the research that we've done, or the things that we're seeing happening with our members, that it's really like it's a handful of people that are really, because backlash for us is a more extreme form of this kind of resistance. So, quite often in these spaces, resistance and backlash are used interchangeably. But what we're seeing is that there is that more extreme form of resistance, which is the backlash, and that's what the media is actually latching on. So we're seeing that the notion or the use of backlash is something that's really coming from or, the media actually amplifying what's really going on. In our experience, of course, we're seeing some resistance coming. I think it would be remiss of us to sit here and think Australia is doing okay, but I think the story is quite nuanced, and also it's still evolving. Like there's so we just did some research. We typically do a member survey. We have about 1,400 members in Australia. Just to give you context, we organize 1,400 member organizations, and they employ about 20% of the Australian workforce. So we got a huge sort of base, I guess, that we speak to. And what we're finding when we did that survey with our members is that we're sort of getting different sort of feedback around how they're responding to this backlash or this resistance. We had like a bigger portion, the majority of our member organizations actually tell us that they're not actually changing anything. In fact, they're doubling down on their efforts, and they're telling us that really we're not making significant changes yet, and we're not anticipating making any significant changes either. There's a vastly large majority of that. And then we've got the opposite end, and it was sort of in the opposite end, almost like, I don't know, like a very low percentage. I think it was 7 or 8% of people that were like, we're going to be quieter, like we're being forced to be quieter about the D&I work that we're doing. Then we've sort of got that, what I call the movable middle, that are in the sit and wait a bit, and that's sort of what we're speaking to at the moment, because and trying to educate about what's the real issue and what's being captured, and also just trying to get our members to understand and restating the value of inclusion and the value of equity in workplaces. So sort of restating that quote unquote business case for inclusion in Australian workplaces, and actually really providing research that's Australian specific. So our members actually focus on our actual jurisdiction, because a lot of the noise that's coming from the United States, and they're completely different jurisdiction, completely different like political climate and political arena. And so we're just trying to kind of have that sort of educational stance with our members, where we're saying this is our actual context in Australia, and in the majority of cases, there's not much change at all. What we're finding with the minority of organizations that are actually making changes, a lot of those are actually organizations that are headquartered in the US, or the ones that are actually in the wait and see kind of category. The organizations that are headquartered in the US, and so they're sort of either saying, well, the policies coming from the US, they're trickling down to us, and so there's changes, or what's happening in the US is happening, but we're not sort of separating from their headquarters, and they're doing their own thing in here. So it's sort of in that sit and wait to see what happens with other organizations. So I think the way we're seeing this manifest in terms of at an organizational level in Australia, it's quite different. It's quite nuanced, and the reasons for it are varying. Of course, misinformation is one of those things, and we're trying to just bring in our research which I'll try not to talk about now, but I'll bring in later, that actually really shows the value of inclusion and focusing on inclusion in Australian workplaces.
Thank you for that context setting. Yeah, Sophie or Jack, at this stage, is there anything that you'd like to add?
I'm happy to take it, Jack, if that works. I think that's really interesting, Virginia, around reflecting on how our context differs in Australia from the US, and what kind of, I'm particularly interested in what legal levers we have here to protect against the backlash. And I think it's worth thinking about and talking about the positive duties that we have under some of our anti-discrimination frameworks, not all, but that's maybe a conversation for later in the session, but also interesting to reflect on how these international narratives can kind of embolden and empower others here. I wanted to add that I think before reflecting on how backlash is showing up differently for different communities, I also want to reflect on how diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives themselves have shown up for different communities, and particularly for the disability community. Many of them, unfortunately, have been quite conditional. You have access to these DEI initiatives as long as you aren't too different. And women with disability experience really persistent barriers to employment, are often underemployed, employed in undervalued and underpaid roles, and experience really persistent discrimination in the context of employment. And a lot of these experiences haven't been touched by some of the initiatives that we have, because many people with disability aren't in the workplaces that these are happening in the first place. Some people with disability in Australia, and particularly thinking about people with intellectual disability here, are employed in segregated settings, and they're paid as little as $3 per hour lawfully. That is lawful in Australia in some circumstances. So I think it's really important to sort of position ourselves within that knowledge. But there are certainly implications that we're seeing for people with disability in relation to the resistance, including increased discrimination and harassment, including public harassment, and also policy choices that we are seeing in Australia, or proposals that might not look to have a disability-specific impact, but they do. So I'm thinking here about moving away from working from home, for example, can have a really significant impact on people with disability. Many of us, working from home allows us to manage our disability needs throughout the day, and sometimes remote and flexible working can be the difference between being able to work and not being able to work. And so this kind of thing does really disproportionately impact our community.
Thank you for that, Sophie. And yeah, I think with my research in the trans space, one of my initial reactions was similar to yours around, the idea of rolling back. And to me, there's, not a lot to roll back in the first place when it comes to trans DEI. But yeah, similarly with disability DEI, there's just, not much there to begin with. So yeah, I'm interested in also drawing through, Virginia, what you were saying around this distinction between backlash and resistance, and how much this kind of resistance and now a little bit of backlash coming through might be a temporary political reaction or part of longer term trends that we might be seeing in Australia. Well, Jack, you haven't had a chance to speak yet, so are you able to speak to trends?
No, it's incredibly intimidating following very articulate, intelligent people. I'm actually just very happy sitting back and listening, but try my best. Yeah, I mean, I'm a political scientist first and foremost, so I feel like I'm quite interested in, I think part of what brings people to sessions like these today is we're all collectively quite shocked at how quickly protections for minoritized communities have fallen away in the United States. Just the sheer speed at which they've been kind of dismantled is really discouraging. And it's an incredibly low information but high anxiety environment for people to be working in. So I think part of why sessions like these are valuable is because we can really get into the nitty-gritty of the detail orientation of ways in which Australia differs from those kind of scary situations that are happening in the United States. I think the political campaign being run by both major parties at the moment, the fact that we're sitting in the middle of the very end, rather, of an election is really interesting to me, because it also shows the ways in which some of these political leaders have tried to mimic the rhetoric that we see overseas and try and import some of those values. And I really resonated with something that Virginia said about that Australia's response to kind of double down and to really go in on DEI in this moment. Because I think there have been political parties, particularly the coalition, that have mimicked that kind of rhetoric, the anti-DEI, go woke, go broke rhetoric. And they've been largely unsuccessful. And part of that, I think, is this unpopularity of the decisions being made by the Trump administration. I think that people are quite shocked at some of the footage that they see coming out of the country. It is antithetical to the idea of what they thought America stood for. And then we kind of shift that gaze back to our own country and our own political and democratic institutions. And you start to pose the question of, well, is it possible for it to happen here if it's possible to happen there? And yeah, people are anxious about those things, understandably. We're definitely not immune to that kind of rhetoric or ideology. Peter Dutton does a very good job of distancing himself from the actual reality of it. He's very policy light. So when he talks about rolling back DEI, he's not going to provide substance for it. But in some of his speeches, he's been fairly direct. I think it was a speech that he made to the Menzies Research Centre on the 31st of January, when he was talking about taking out about 36,000 public service jobs. The kind of jobs that he identified as, it's signaling wastage in public service, there were things like culture, diversity and inclusion advisors. So people directly working in this space in the public sector. So he does a good job of distancing himself, but when forced to reveal some of those policy messages, it's the first thing that kind of springs to mind for him. To speak more directly to your question about trends, I think that we have this kind of complacency in thinking that progress is a pendulum that swings back and forth, and that we make incremental progress in some regards, and that we should expect there to be a backlash towards that progress. I mean, working in this space for a while, I think that there are truths to that, but one of the consistent things remains that pendulum doesn't swing back towards progress on its own. It's wrenched back by collective action. And so I think really, really, standing in solidarity with each other and working towards that pendulum swinging towards progress, that's the kind of moment that we're sitting in at the moment. But I would love to hear everyone else's thoughts as well.
Virginia, I saw you do a little hand. Do you want to jump in?
Jax ended up talking to something that I wanted to talk to about, the fact that resistance and backlash is actually inevitable in sort of progressive sort of spaces when you're talking about social change. Or social change that will benefit those people who are at the margins or people who are most marginalized. And so we are aware that it's inevitable, and that's, as Jack said, that's happened throughout history anyway. But the important thing is what happens then to sort of the resistance to that backlash. So that's why for me the thing about resistance and backlash are quite important, because I think so some of the discussions, the debates that I'm hearing from community, and this is not necessarily from the work that we're doing with organizations in Australian workplaces, but what's happening in community, because I also work with like African communities and culturally and racially marginalized communities broadly, etc. And what we're hearing from that is, to be honest, a lot of people, particularly when it comes to culturally and racially marginalized communities, they're looking at this backlash and saying, well, actually, it was inevitable. It was always going to happen because, not everybody was really benefiting from the DEI rhetoric anyway. It was, and as Sophie's said, it was benefiting some groups more than others. And so there were other people that were being left out, and racially marginalized groups are part of those communities as well that weren't necessarily any DEI initiatives. If you look at them, they, in Australia, because we don't talk about race or racism as a power structure or anything like that, even though we have the Race Discrimination Act, we're more focused on compliance to that act, not racism itself. And so those groups aren't typically included. And so for some of those groups, they're kind of going back to basics, as Sophie was saying, in terms of let's actually talk about, maybe take this as an opportunity to actually use, double down on language that's more relevant to where we are. Because part of the things that we've been grappling with at DCA as well is sort of trying to reassure, I guess, our members, is this where there's this sort of, we're not sure what to do, or we might have to scale back. Part of the discussions are going to language. Should we use different language that's not DEI, or should we start using somewhere else? And so there's a lot of discussions around the significance of language to actually represent the lived experiences of people. So I think, yes, backlash is inevitable, but the resistance to that backlash, to see it maybe more as an opportunity to pivot and do something that's a bit more, that's even more inclusive, rather than actually scale back. Because I completely agree with what Sophie was saying before, that we haven't even had the gains that we want or that we expect. And so to talk about scaling back or rolling back, some of that, to me, is absolutely bizarre. And also to recognize that backlash has always been a preserve of privilege. The reason why backlash happens, it's that kind of thing that happens in defense of institutionalized privilege. That's what it is, right? So it's kind of like, when we're having these conversations, I'm constantly always like having to remind people, hey, let's think about whose interests are we defending, and whose voices are we centering, and are we privileging here? Because backlash is by default, or by design really, an act of defending privilege, and it always comes from people who are privileged. So and also recognize that that takes a lot of forms, because I think part of the thing is the focus is on the more overt forms of backlash, rather than the more kind of subtle that are working in the background to maintain the status quo, rather than to roll back.
Yeah, thank you for that, Virginia. And I think that is already really foreshadowing and touching on one of the questions I was going to ask next, which is really great, which is around these factors that drive skepticism and resistance to these kinds of initiatives, but also how those, like, that skepticism and resistance might link to misconceptions about diversity policies and what workplace adjustments might actually need to be challenged in public discourse. And also adding into that what role the media has played in kind of furthering some of these things. So Sophie, would you mind speaking to that?
Thanks, Jacko. I want to echo what Virginia has said about, resistance and backlash often being driven because DEI is perceived as a threat to existing privileges. And I'm not a political scientist, but my understanding is that might be particularly pronounced in times of economic uncertainty and insecurity. And this becomes, I think, really clear when some of the scapegoating is particularly bizarre. We recently saw in the US, the government repealed guidance for businesses to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, linking accessibility requirements to the cost of living, which again, it highlights that sort of the economic insecurity, and also leads into some of these misconceptions. So I think one of the key misconceptions, and particularly around workplace adjustments for people with disability, is that people with disability are seen as a cost or a burden across so many areas of life. We're seen as the cost of a workplace adjustment for businesses, or the cost of the NDIS in the media. When we talk about the care economy, we're seen as recipients of care, never providers of care, despite 40% of primary carers having disability. We're seen as an object of charity, Often when I say that I work for an organisation that's led by and for women with disabilities, the response is like, oh, that's so good of you, as though it's benevolent and not linked to professional expertise, and as though I'm not also a woman with disability. We're seen as, costs and burdens and not as rights holders or employees, leaders, experts who can bring value. I think another misconception is that DEI initiatives will result in hiring unqualified people, obviously the merits-based kind of argument, and that disability is somehow a liability. And that really just reflects unfounded and harmful stereotypes, and they're rooted in denial of our capacity. You might have seen some really deeply concerning reports that President Trump blamed workers with disability for a really tragic plane crash recently, stating that it followed decisions to implement DEI initiatives which resulted in people with disability being hired, notwithstanding a sheer lack of evidence that was the cause. And disability organisations in the US issued strong statements saying, diversity initiatives, as we know, expand the pool of qualified candidates for a role. They don't supersede the qualifications and skills that the role requires. But another misconception is that our needs and experiences are somehow rare or unique. But people with disability are 1 in 5 Australians. We're a part of every community and we deserve to be a part of every workplace. But many of the adjustments that a lot of us might need or want are actually also good for accessibility for everyone. Plain English, great for people who use English as an additional language. Flexible work hours, great for parents and carers. Working from home, great for productivity. I'd really like to see a move from thinking about workplace accommodations as a cost and a burden, and also move away from seeing them only as based on an individual, shifting to a baseline standard of accessibility across all workplaces. What could make this workplace accessible to everyone, not just the person who managed to get through the door and take the really significant risk of asking for a change to meet their needs.
Thank you, Sophie. And yeah, I think that links so well to what Virginia was saying around resistance also coming from people in places of privilege, that a lot of these kinds of accommodations perceived as not needed from those places of privilege, but actually flipping that around and saying what happens when we do re-examine these systems and what opportunities might actually open up if we start, listening to marginalized perspectives and, lifting those up, and what kind of benefit the wider employee base will actually see. Yeah, thank you. Let's see. So yeah, considering some of those ideas that we've just been chatting about, for those of us working across multiple areas of marginalization, such as race, disability, gender, and sexuality, does the backlash feel different or more acute, or what kinds of patterns might we be noticing? Yeah, I'm happy for anyone to jump in on this if anyone has any initial thoughts.
I'm happy to go. I was trying to, I feel like I've been talking quite a bit, so I was trying to get Sophie and Jack to go first, but I'm happy to go. I think that's a brilliant question, because I think it actually goes to the core of one of the things that we're really focused on at DCA at the moment, which is intersectionality, and always kind of thinking when we're talking diversity and inclusion, like how do we get to do this in a way that we kind of go to those who are most marginalized, and recognizing that, for example, when we're focusing on gender equality or racial equity, or whatever it is that our focus is, that we're actually going and understanding that people experience marginality differently when they sit at the intersection of multiple power structures. And so it's really important. To answer your question directly, as in what trends we're seeing, I don't know that we anyone can answer that in terms of truthfully from an intersectionality perspective can answer this question. And perhaps there is, and I'm very happy to stand corrected. The reason why I say I don't know that anyone can answer that is just because I don't know that we're intersectionality is something that we're doing particularly well yet in Australia. I think we're still kind of doing a diversity approach where we say we're focusing on this group and then that group and then that group and then that group, which is kind of in silos. And even within those silos, we're not necessarily looking at even like if it's gender, for example, how various categories of women are experiencing inequity or marginality. The assumption is that gender discrimination is the preeminent sort of entry point. So I think for me, it's like, I really appreciate that question. I like that question. We work a lot with working on a project funded by the Office for Women at the moment called RISE, which ANU is part of. And through that project, we're noticing a lot this lack of intersectionality lens, and yet the need for it, where my knee-jerk reaction would be, of course, it's the experiences of people who experiencing who are multiply marginalized. The experiences are going to be heightened. The experiences are going to be compounded, because looking at gender discrimination, or gender or sexism, is different from considering gendered racism, which is the intersection of sexism and racism. So my knee-jerk response would be the discrimination or the impacts of all of this talk is very much heightened, it's compounded. But the reality of it, I don't know that we can speak to any particular trends with definitive data.
Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to, again, acknowledging Virginia's very pertinent comment about the difficulty to speak to an intersectional experience. But from a queer perspective, I think my gears were turning with something that Sophie said about the examples out of the United States and the scapegoating that happens. So in the United States, in the last presidential election, approximately $200 million US were put in for advertising purposes in swing states that were scapegoating trans people, essentially. A lot of the slogans that were repeated were things like, Kamala Harris isn't for you, she's for they, them, and stuff like that. So like there's a really concerted and very highly funded area that is very interested in that kind of scapegoating of particular members of the queer community. And that stuff, it's evident in Australia as well. In our last federal election, we had Catherine Deebs, who was put up for the seat of Warringah, and she she brought that kind of anti-trans people in women's sport rhetoric and was like resoundingly rejected, which was very encouraging. But then we have the recent decision out of Queensland from Health Minister Tim Nicholls to suspend gender-affirming care to teenagers and young people in the state. And that one was really worrying for a number of reasons, but mostly because his own justification out of the office was clearly misinformed by misinformation and disinformation, and actually wasn't very rooted in scientific fact, and was largely denounced by Queensland and Australian national scientists and healthcare professionals. And so that's one example. Another example I would point to that feels different and particularly acute is some research that we did at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership pertaining to the experiences of queer people online, specifically queer politicians. And we were using the last federal election as a case study to see whether queer politicians experienced more harassment on spaces like X. It wasn't that they experienced proportionally more harassment to heterosexual politicians. The nature of that harassment that they were experiencing was incredibly acute, very personal, and very vitriolic. And it didn't further political conversation. It didn't add to a political campaign. It was deeply personal, relating to aspects of their identity, their gender expression, their race and ethnicity. And that's really devastating because online spaces are incredibly important for political discussion. They're a kind of immovable necessity in the media landscape today. I suspect that those conditions have gotten even worse in 2025. My personal preference as a queer person is that I'm no longer on platforms like Twitter because I've just found them to be intolerable. But for certain careers, you have to have a presence on those spaces. So I do fear for people who by nature have to have a space in an area that is really upsetting to them. And the internet has always been a very important space for queer people in finding community. So it's upsetting that these spaces that used to be very welcoming and great sources of information and a really like community building space for queer people are now incredibly hostile and providing a bit of a freezing effect on the queer people's ability to run for things like public office.
Thank you, Jack. And yeah, I'm interested in drawing a couple of threads together and beginning to look forward. And we've chatted a lot about intersectionality and already heard from Sophie a little bit around when you prioritize thinking about disability, what benefits we can actually see for everybody else. But yeah, for all of us here, what does true intersectional inclusion look like in practice? And how can organizations move beyond these kind of single issue approaches and create workplaces that are safe and empowering for everybody? I feel bad calling on someone in particular, so anyone want to make a start? I know it's a big question. Yeah, Sophie.
Happy to give it a go. And it can be an iterative answer to this big question as we all contribute. I think thinking about what I mentioned earlier, coming from a place of universal design, accessibility, inclusion first approaches to working and just existing in the workplace. I think it requires really genuine system change, structural change, not just having a network in your workplace, not just a morning tea with cupcakes, but a grappling with employment and workplace practices at their very core, a grappling with power structures and fixing the way that employment and workplaces are structured for only one way of existing. And I think when it comes to accessibility, also broadening our understanding of accessibility. We talk a lot about physical, informational, and attitudinal accessibility. So we're not just talking about ramps and elevators, although these are critical, they might be the first things that come to mind, but we're talking about that and a lot more. What does it look like, for instance, to be a workplace that accommodates chronic illness, fatigue? Some of these are experiences that are more prevalent for women with disability, but also across everybody's lives. And I think this really requires whole of organisation, dialogue, training, accountability, but with the people most impacted in leadership roles in that accountability.
Yeah, I think we're all going to have difficulty answering this question. It's very, very big. I think the best thing that I can think of is this idea of like, we have these aspects of our lived experience or our identities that feel highly managed by ourselves when in a workplace. And in a lot of the research that I do, that looks like, gender expression and sexuality or your sexual orientation. Certainly disability and accessibility are there, race and ethnicity. Part of what an ideal workplace, if such a thing could ever exist, looks like, I think, is those aspects being celebrated, but also not something that the individual is forced to manage on themselves. I think we will probably allude to it a little bit later on, but there are areas in which it would be very difficult, I think, for a DEI rollback in the way that it's unfolded in the United States to unfold here in the US. To my understanding, things like our anti-discrimination statutes in Australian jurisdictions have special measures or similar exemptions for affirmative action initiatives. So it's things like affirmative action in the United States can be repealed quite easily. It's much more difficult in Australia. And then we also, as Sophie mentioned earlier, we have a positive federal duty that's enshrined in the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984, responsive to the Respect at Work report, and that really obliges employers to take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate both direct and indirect discrimination on the grounds of sex. But I think, so those are really great protections that we have in place currently, and I hope that that kind of assuages any high anxiety of anyone in the audience that feels like these things are going to happen immediately in Australia. They're obviously only as kind of robust and protected as our institutions remain robust and protected, and trusted as well is a really important thing. But yeah, I completely agree with the statements made by Sophie in Virginia about looking at ways in which industrial relations and the system that we have in this country has really worked to exclude or really never included certain bodies or certain people of experience, and ways in which we can knuckle down in this moment, in this doubling down moment of DEI, as it were, and really think about ways in which we can expand and make the workplace accessible, productive, happy, and safe for people of all experiences.
Thank you. I just wanted to add maybe something that's a little bit, I don't know, maybe not controversial, but maybe something that we're picking up at DCA as well, because we actually just recently we're about to launch some guidelines on applying intersectionality at work, guidelines, because we noticed this idea of intersectional inclusion is, particularly in this climate, is really, in this political climate, is really, I think it's quite topical. But what we've noticed is that there is actually a lack of conceptual clarity on what that actually means, let alone what that will look like in practice. And I think the issue is, again, like I said earlier, like the notion of people actually understanding what does intersectionality itself mean. And so to say that we're actually being intersectionally inclusive, what does that actually look like? So we're sort of, I suppose at DCA, where we're sitting at the moment is more at this end where we're sort of saying, like increasing your intersectionality literacy is part of that process of moving towards intersectional inclusion. So we're being a bit considered when we're sort of the advice that we're giving, as in it looks like this, because the reality of it is that even our legislation, even our legal system is actually siloed. It's the legislation, the legislative environment that we're working with, which organizations obviously, when they're kind of looking at the compliance end, they are looking at legislation that's in and of itself just really looking at one diversity dimension or one silo. So for example, you can only bring a case even if you go to the Australian Human Rights Commission, for example, it's through like it's the RDA or the DDA or the whatever, like you gotta pick and choose. So there was a case years ago at the commission where, I don't know, I'm sure I can speak about this publicly, but I don't know, where some women who are actually culturally and racially marginalized women of a very specific group of women went and they had to actually make that decision of like, do we do this under the RDA or the SDA? And their thing was like, well, actually it's neither, it's both of those, but they couldn't, and so the case ended up not actually being heard. And so I'm just giving that as an example to like, when we then kind of take it to like bring it down to now talk about intersectional inclusion in the workplaces, when the legislative environment itself doesn't even the law is not intersectional, and therefore the compliance that we're going to be looking to be doing is not going to be intersectional, and therefore our DEI practices aren't going to be intersectional. So I feel like there's a lot of kind of processes and thoughts that we have to think about before we can actually say, like, what does this look like in practice? Because we're sort of working in there. So what, like I said, on the RISE project, we literally got money from the government to look at, to design this intersectionality project that looks at gendered racism, and therefore focusing on culturally and racially marginalized women in Australian workplaces and why they're not actually being seen in executive leadership positions. And what we found through that project, and I think I can speak this candidly, I can speak to this candidly, is it was very difficult for us to really focus squarely on the notion of gendered racism itself, because the racial literacy in Australian workplaces is quite low. So what we've ended up doing is spending a lot of time actually focusing on one aspect of that, which is we might be doing gender inequality a bit okay in Australia. We're not there yet, and I'm not even saying we're anywhere near it. It's still binary. It's still, there's a lot of things even missing even within that movement. But the racial equality or the racial equity movement is so pretty much non-existent. And so to talk about gendered racism is really difficult. So to advise people on do this when you're looking at gendered racism, it's almost like giving them solutions to a problem that they don't quite understand. And so that's why we do have, like, our guidelines do have sort of solutions in saying this is how you do intersectionality well, but we do spend a lot of time actually trying to go to that conceptual clarity as well of what you need to think about. Because the thing with intersectional inclusion is it's a concept that relies on other concepts in order to do it, and then that relies on the legislation in order to do it. And so I guess I'm not giving a solution. I'm just sort of disrupting the thought of what does it look like in practice. It's just kind of thinking there's other things we gotta clean up first before we kind of go to that. I call it like the bias to action. So we sort of want to act, which is a good thing because that's what we want to do, right? But at the same time, if we act, it ends up being this tick box exercise and it ends up being missing. So for example, organizations aren't collecting data that allows them to do the kinds of intersectional analysis that gets to who in our organization is the most marginalized because they embody these multiple kind of oppressions, right? What they're doing is they get data and it's still very much in the silo, where it might allow them to do like an analysis of, say, gender and age maybe, but anything else beyond this, like really kind of these other nuances, it's not there. So to then say have an intersectional inclusion when you don't even know what's the state of play at the moment is really quite I think it's sort of jumping. What is the term? Jumping the queue or jumping the gun or whatever the phrase is. I don't know.
Putting the cart before the horses.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Thank you. Sorry, that wasn't like a solution thing, but I'm sort of just like, it's a brain tickling thing for us to think about sometimes when we talk about these things. What are we actually perpetuating perhaps unintentionally in the process, or what are we missing by asking some of the things?
Yeah, thank you for that. I know we're getting a bit close to time, so I'm going to try and synthesize some of the questions from the audience and kind of staying in this kind of space that we've just been discussing. There's a couple of questions around how like navigating workplaces where people do kind of feel empowered to complain about DEI related initiatives. But also how that rhetoric is then, or what kind of rhetoric those people are harnessing. So things around reverse discrimination, in terms of the rhetoric that we might be hearing directly from people who are kind of pushing this resistance and reaching that backlash kind of level. How can we operate and speak back to those kinds of narratives? It's a pretty big question. Sophie, are you feeling willing to step up and speak?
I don't know that I have an answer, which is very unfortunate. But I'm thinking about what Virginia has just shared as well, and thinking, you know, our organisation operates really firmly within a human rights framework, and we're always bringing back to, you know, the links between gender and disability and the full range of rights. And I wish that we could say, have a conversation about rights and about violations of rights in the workplace, and about, our inalienable human rights that we all have to participate in the workplace on an equal basis with others, and that could be an effective response to some of these things. But I don't think we're there yet. I don't think that we have the kind of rights literacy in Australia, and that's been sort of picked up enough for it to be a rebuttal. But I do think it kind of speaks to some of the legal framework issues. So obviously, as Virginia's mentioned, we've got these siloed, segmented anti-discrimination frameworks that just don't make sense. I'm not disabled and also a little bit of a woman. So how do I choose which legal framework that I bring something under? But this presents an opportunity for a conversation about human rights in Australia, and I think presents an opportunity for a National Human Rights Act that would translate the international human rights standards into domestic law and start this conversation. Again, I'm not a cultural change expert, so this is hopeful, this is optimistic, but I think setting up these frameworks for greater human rights protections, these positive human rights protections, and then literacy around human rights, to bring that in as part of the conversation in response to some of the backlash.
I'm happy to jump in and just reaffirm what Sophie's just said, because I really like the kind of shift to a more kind of integration of human rights frameworks in the DEI space. It's something that DCA has been, again, also focusing on, just because I think the DEI framework is really, the human rights framework is really good in terms of, yes, linking into some of those international frameworks as well, but also I feel that it's just kind of bringing back the humanization aspect and the fact that this is about equity as opposed to just focusing on either diversity, which I think a lot of the debates in the US are more about, like, diversity is the word diversity itself is the one that's really more problematic. You don't really hear the word equity, because once you start to go there, like, it's a different discussion altogether. So I really like the human rights framing, and in places like Canada, like, human rights frameworks are the more dominant frameworks in the DEI space anyway. So it's not like we'll be doing something completely like unheard of. And so I think for me, the humanization element of these discussions is really important. And what I mean by that is just bringing it back to where are the people with lived experiences of these? Because we got to remember, and this is one thing that we're focusing on as well at DCA in terms of like, where are the people that are actually on the receiving end of these discussions and what's happening to them in the workplaces? And that's what we've been advising our members to think about, going to, so people like culturally and racially marginalized people with disabilities, people like LGBTIQ plus communities, because they're the ones that are actually being singled out in some of these discussions and some of this backlash, and centering their voices and their experiences of what it is like to embody this backlash. Because you're quite right, Jacko, in terms of we're seeing as well in our work that some of the voices that were sort of just like in the background or underneath there, people are feeling emboldened to say things and to voice out their fear that they're being pushed out, or they're just being pushed to the margins, etc. So one of it, like, we're advising our members to really focus on lived experience and lived expertise, or as we call it. The other one is just in like general literacy, like, so that brings in a counter narrative to this dominant discourse. We do at DCA what's called an Inclusion at Work Index, that just really looks at what do people think in organizations about inclusion anyway. And really, when you look at that, it's very clear, our data is very clear about the link between workplaces that are inclusive and increased productivity, increased, well-being of its workers, increased innovation, etc., etc. It's all online on the DCA website. I'm not going to cite statistics or anything, but it's really clear. And so we sort of sometimes are advising, go back to basics, really, of like explaining your North Star as an organization, your why, as well. It really kind of helps people understand and just debunk that fear and that misinformation.
Thank you. Yes. And I know that we're really pressed up against time, and we definitely haven't gotten to all of the amazing questions that have been submitted. And I've had a little skim through, and I've really seen a strong theme in those questions where people are asking, but what can be done? What can we be doing? With a sense of persistence and a sense of frustration. And with all of that, for all of us here who are really passionate about inclusion, but perhaps feeling that frustration, feeling the what to do, and feeling a bit exhausted, what keeps you hopeful and motivated in this work? Please jump in with all of your advice. Or I'll call out Jack. Let's start with you.
Yeah, kind of reluctant to contribute because the exhaustion is real and that frustration is very real. I think just one thing kind of jumping off the answers from the last question would be, I think that there's a really great opportunity for, executive leaders, business owners, CEOs to really step into this space and kind of not put their money where their mouth is, but really, I think there's a fantastic space to be to stand for diversity, equity, inclusion within your workplace, to state that that's something that your business is, it's kind of core to the business practice, and to really, there's an incentive for businesses to make themselves attractive workplaces to retain people, and that's just kind of like a bare minimum thing. As to my own exhaustion, mine is it's almost reverse psychology kind of encouraged. Just this idea that the powers that be are banking on my compliance or my exhaustion, my submission, and that pisses me off. And I don't want to do what they're asking of me. And that it sometimes just to keep this theme of siloing and individualism, that this action, this work can feel really lonely or isolating or exhausting, and that the kind of acknowledgement and realization that the actions that I am doing and the team that I'm working with, we're contributing to collective actions and collective ideas. And I think that we're not trying to seek to end the conversation, we're trying to seek to contribute to the conversation. So I find that to be invigorating and passionate. And I say that monotone and looking exhausted, so I'll finish there.
Amazing. Sophie or Virginia, do you have maybe a 5-word little plug of how you keep yourself going in these times?
I find my tribe. I just find I've had conversations because we talk a lot to DEI practitioners at DCA, and yes, as Jack said, the exhaustion, it's so real because sometimes you just feel like you're going against the tide, and so it's really real. But I'm always encouraging people. I'm this, for some people, equity is not it's not a political act. It's not the flavor of the day, the flavor of the month. It's not a political weapon. It's their life, right? When you're really at the margins and you don't get access to this, it's such a, I don't have the luxury of feeling exhausted by this stuff because it's my life. I'm actually it's, you know what I mean? And so I say to people, find your tribe. At DCA, we literally have what we call third space chats, where we literally on DCA time meet as people working in this space, particularly those who have subject matter expertise and lived experience at the same time. So it's not just a day job, it's your life. So we sit, we meet, we talk, we chat. And so finding your tribe helps a lot because you get to trauma dump on each other, which is not necessarily a good thing, but it helps to sort of, as Jack said, because you got to go back and do the resistance to the backlash.
And Sophie, why don't you close us off?
Sure, I completely agree, Virginia. You know, it's not an opt-out process for those of us whose lived realities are impacted by this work, and when we're working in it and we're living it, it's particularly confronting and exhausting. And so I think cross-movement collaboration just gets me. I just love it. I love to see when we've got the gender space picking up disability issues, disability space picking up gender issues in our area of work. Really it sort of inspires and mobilizes. And I think the other thing is just thinking about celebrating the wins, no matter how small they are. As a systemic advocacy organisation, I've been reflecting on the fact that sometimes what a win is not even bringing about a new good, but preventing a bad. And that's something I've had to grapple with, and I'm learning to be okay with that and celebrating those wins.
Thank you. Thank you to each of our panelists for joining us here today. This has been such a heartening conversation, a really necessary conversation. So thank you all for joining, and apologies for running a little bit over. I appreciate that so many of you have stuck around to the very end. And a reminder that this recording will be going online. We appreciated the conversation today. Keep it going, share this again with your colleagues and your friends. And keep in contact with Jewel. If you follow us at Jewel ANU on Instagram, that's a really great space to keep up to date with what we're up to. And yeah, keep on going with the good work, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacko. Thanks, Sophie and Virginia.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.